The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, a better deal for Americanism or globalism? We'll find out today. So, for those of you who may not recall, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, is intended to replace the 1994 NAFTA agreement. Now, when the USMCA text was initially released back on September 30th of 2018 on the USTR website, it totaled for 1,812 pages in its initial draft. It has since then been revised to a total of 2,325 pages when it was released again on the date that it was signed back on November 30th of 2018. The parties involved in this negotiation, of course, include the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So, is the USMCA a big win, as President Trump has been calling it? On the day the USMCA text was initially released, President Trump in a ceremony went to the Rose Garden and said, "Throughout the campaign, I promised to renegotiate NAFTA, and today we have kept that promise." So on the day that President Trump made his remarks from the Rose Garden, behind him were standing various officials who work at the USTR office and at the State Department who helped craft the new USMCA agreement. Now, many of the individuals behind him also had worked in the Obama administration crafting the TPP agreement. In fact, Trevor Kincaid, who was the Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Public and Media Affairs for the Obama administration, essentially the PR spokesperson for the USTR office during the Obama era, said this about the individuals standing behind President Trump. Ironically, he called them horrible negotiators when running for office. It's really the same with the new name. It's basically the 22 Jump Street of trade deals. Now, Mr. Kincaid had worked on the TPP agreement, as had many of the individuals in the previous photos standing behind President Trump. And like Kincaid pointed out, Trump called them bad negotiators and called the TPP one of the worst trade deals ever negotiated. Now, the same people who worked on that were behind the scenes working on the USMCA agreement. So, this begs the question, is the USMCA the same old like the TPP? Or is it something totally new? Should we give the benefit of the doubt to these individuals who worked on the USMCA? Which one is it? Well, the day after the USMCA text, or actually the day that the text was itself released, that very morning, the U.S. Ambassador to Canada, actually the former U.S. Ambassador to Canada, that is, Bruce Heyman, said this, praising the agreement from CNBC's Squawk Box. He said, "It's obviously welcome news. This is welcome news for North America. It's welcome news for the markets, obviously, this morning." You may not recognize Mr. Heyman. However, his resume is quite impressive from a globalist standpoint. In addition to being a board member of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which is an affiliate of the pro-One World Government Council on Foreign Relations based in New York, Ambassador Heyman, has also served as the vice president for Goldman Sachs and served in the Obama administration as the U.S. Ambassador to Canada, having been appointed by President Obama, or nominated by President Obama in 2013, and then thereafter confirmed by the U.S. Senate in 2014. Ambassador Heyman stayed in that post until Obama's last day in office. Speaking about the agreement, Ambassador Heyman had a chance to review the text of the USMCA before his morning appearance on CNBC's Squawk Box, and this is what he had to say after reviewing the USMCA text. He said on television, "From some of the reads I got overnight, 2/3 of this agreement is essentially going back to TPP. All they did was take so much of the language of TPP and implement it here as it pertains to Canada." There you have it from Ambassador Heyman, and a key individual who worked on the TPP negotiations, who worked to bring Canada on board to be part of that previous agreement. And here we have him saying, "Hey, look at this USMCA. A lot of what I'm seeing here comes straight out of what we did before in the TPP." So, what is the TPP? If you don't recall, the TPP was a massive trade agreement that was proposed with the United States and 11 other Pacific Rim nations, including Mexico and Canada, like in NAFTA and the USMCA, but other nations too, like Peru and others throughout the Pacific Rim Basin. Now, all these countries with the United States would have accounted for 40% of the global GDP. Since then, the TPP has gone ahead without the United States, since President Trump, in keeping true to his campaign promise, withdrew the United States from the TPP in his first month in office. Now, the TPP has since been renamed to the CPTPP, which stands for the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on Trans-Pacific Partnership. And Canada and Mexico remain in it, and other countries in the Pacific Rim that weren't part of the original TPP are also considering to join it. Now, here on the screen we have, to your left, you'll see Chapter 27 of the TPP, and on the right you'll see Chapter 30 of the USMCA. Both of these chapters are very identical. In fact, they have the same exact names, the Administrative and Institutional Provisions chapter. This is a key chapter to both of the agreements because in both cases, this is the chapter that establishes the administrative or executive governing body for each of the agreements once they go into effect. In the case of the TPP, Chapter 27 established the TPP Commission, and in the case of the USMCA, its Chapter 30 establishes the creation of the Free Trade Commission. So what exactly is this Free Trade Commission in the USMCA? Well, it is an international bureaucracy. For under it are about 16 or so various committees that are subordinate to the Free Trade Commission. All of these committees are actually found in the various chapters of the USMCA that correspond to their particular subject. For example, in the Environment chapter of the USMCA agreement, there is a call to establish an Environment Committee, and so forth throughout the USMCA. So, in one of these committees of note right now is the Competitiveness Committee, which we find established in Chapter 26 of the USMCA, the chapter on competitiveness. In fact, the full name of the committee would be the North American Competitiveness Committee. And we see the purpose of this committee in the text. It says there in Chapter 26 in point 2, with a view to promoting further economic integration among the parties and enhancing the competitiveness of North American exports, the parties hereby establish a North American Competitiveness Committee, or Competitiveness Committee, composed of government representatives of each party. So this committee won't be made of elected officials elected by the people of Canada, Mexico, and the United States. No, these are going to be government officials that are representatives that will be sent by the governments of these countries. They won't be elected. We won't have a say. And the purpose of these representatives within this committee specifically is, as stated, to promote further economic integration between all three parties, the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. And part of their purpose is to enhance the competitiveness of North American exports, meaning that their objective isn't to necessarily expand the exports of just Canada or just the U.S., but all of our exports as a whole. So in the same chapter 26, if we go on further down, in regards to the powers or duties of the Competitiveness Committee, it states that the Competitiveness Committee shall discuss effective approaches and develop information sharing activities to support a competitive environment in North America that facilitates trade and investment between the parties and promotes, here it is again, economic integration and development within the free trade area. So what does that mean? Integration, economic integration. Well, first we have to find out what integration means, the key word there. So now, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, integration is defined simply as the action or process of integrating. So then this begs the question, what does the word integrate mean? Well, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, integrate means to combine one thing with another to form a whole. So in this case, what are we combining? What is the one thing or other that we're combining? We're combining the economy of the United States, the economy of Mexico, and the economy of Canada with each other to form a whole new economy, to form a whole North American economy. That's the purpose of the competitiveness chapter. And if we go on in the competitiveness chapter, it states here regarding the committee that it will provide advice and recommendations as appropriate to the Commission on ways to further enhance the competitiveness of the North American economy. Hold on right there. Did you catch that? The North American economy. Now you tell me, is there a difference between North America's economies or the North American economy? Yes, there's a huge difference. Words matter, people. On the day that the USMCA was signed in Buenos Aires, Argentina on November 30th, 2018, the then President of Mexico, Enrique Peña Nieto, in his remarks, which he delivered in Spanish, said this: "The renegotiation of the new trade agreement sought to safeguard the vision of an integrated North America." There we have President Enrique Peña Nieto virtually telling us the objective, the purpose behind the USMCA agreement before he gave his remarks. President Trump gave his remarks, which of course were naturally in English. And the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, gave his remarks both bilingually in English and then translating them as well into French. But in the remarks of both President Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau, they both spoke about how this agreement would be beneficial to the American economy, to the Canadian economy, because it would bring jobs to both, how it would grow the middle class of both Americans and Canadians. But Peña Nieto's remarks, which were only in Spanish, none provided in English, in his remarks, he stated, yes, a little bit about how it would benefit the Mexican worker and the Mexican economy for sure, but he spoke a lot about economic integration, mentioning it a total of 4 times in his remarks that were delivered only in Spanish and covered only in the Mexican press. Later that very day, President Peña Nieto of Mexico took to Twitter, where he tweeted the following: "On my last day as president, I am very honored to have participated in the signing of the new trade treaty between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. This day concludes a long process of dialogue and negotiation that will consolidate the economic integration of North America." Speaking also about Twitter, Peña Nieto wasn't the only one boasting about the globalist objectives of the USMCA. A month earlier, when the initial text of the USMCA was released, the 1,812-page version, Richard Haass, who is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, tweeted the following on October 1st. "The USMCA looks to be the trade pact formerly known as NAFTA plus 10 to 20%. Hope it becomes a precedent for TPP." Then the next day he tweeted, after looking at it a little bit more, he tweeted, "USMCA is NAFTA plus TPP plus a few tweaks." So there you have, straight from the horse's mouth, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations boasting about this agreement. He loves what he saw. Not only did it to him initially seem like the same old NAFTA, but it seemed like it had all the language of the TPP, as we discussed earlier. What about the position of the Canadian government? After all, Prime Minister Trudeau and his cabinet are of the Liberal Party of Canada, which is a very progressive political party in Canada. Well, his main NAFTA/USMCA negotiator was the Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister, Chrystia Freeland. And this is what she had to say about the USMCA following the release of the initial text. She described it as, quote, "a very progressive trade agreement." And this, by the way, was covered all throughout the Canadian press. No mention of this was found in any mainstream American news coverage. So how exactly is the USMCA a progressive trade agreement? Was that just something that she was saying to placate the Liberal Party base in Canada to support the agreement in Parliament? Or is she in fact right? Is this agreement actually a progressive agreement as she described it? After all, she was the top negotiator for Canada. I think she'd be quite aware of what's in the text of the agreement. So let's take a look at that. For example, in the labor chapter alone, which is chapter 23, and perhaps maybe the most progressive of the chapters in the USMCA, or at least one of the most progressive, if not the most progressive chapter, we find in here that the U.S. along with Canada and Mexico, would be subordinated to the International Labor Organization. In addition to that, Chapter 23 on labor here affirms the U.S., Mexico, and Canada's commitment to the Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, as well as to the Declaration on Social Justice for a Fair Globalization. You tell me if that sounds progressive or conservative. I'll let you decide that one. But in regards to those two declarations from the ILO, none of those have been individually or specifically ratified by our U.S. Senate. So by entering into this USMCA agreement, we would be affirming a commitment to a declaration that our Senate has never ratified, never supported in the past. In addition to that, the USMCA agreement in Chapter 23 calls for collective bargaining. Also in Chapter 23, we find workplace gender identity protections. This is taking something and transferring it not to the federal or national government level, which would be unconstitutional, but rather to the international level, which is even worse. So this is even worse than being unconstitutional. It goes beyond that to a whole new sphere of erosion of our national sovereignty, of our state laws, let alone our national federal laws. So in regards to Chapter 23, or the labor chapter, Article 23.3 of that chapter states, each party shall adopt and maintain in its statutes and regulations, in other words, in its laws, and practices thereunder, the following rights as stated in the ILO Declaration on Rights at Work. So here we find from the onset the USMCA subordinating the U.S. to the ILO and to the ILO's definition of what rights are. Furthermore, on down in Article 23.9, we find that the USMCA calls for all the parties involved, again, U.S., Canada, and Mexico, to recognize the goal of eliminating discrimination in employment and occupation. That might not necessarily be a bad thing, of course, but if you read on further down, when you read about the kind of discrimination that all the parties involved, all countries, have to agree to eliminate as their goal through laws, you all go on down, you see they're highlighted on the screen, gender identity. Again, there is no federal law on that realm or area of discrimination. So to have laws on that subject having to be pushed on us by the USMCA is a total attack on the sovereignty of our laws, an attack on our Congress, forcing it to do something that has not been agreed to or desired by the majority of the American people. So further on down, we find that as part of the goal of this chapter, that all the parties involved have to work towards the promotion of equality and elimination of employment discrimination in the areas of age, disability, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, and there it is again, gender identity. This is sprinkled all throughout Chapter 23. Further on down, you may have noticed highlighted on the screen here that in addition to those areas that have to be protected, we read here below that there has to be promotion of equality, elimination of employment discrimination, and protection of migrant workers and other vulnerable workers. In other words, immigrants or illegal immigrants as well. In fact, this area of immigration or migration being a subject under the realm of the USMCA was also under the sphere of was also found within the TPP. Here on your screen on the left side, you'll see Article 11 or Chapter 11 of the TPP, and then you see on the right side Chapter 17 of the USMCA. Both chapters in their respective agreements deal with market access. And in both of these chapters, we have here discussion about how both agreements are to advance the immigration agenda without the ability of the governments involved to place restrictions. In fact, when former U.S. Senator Jeff Sessions went to the floor of the Senate to expose the TPP, he quoted the very same parts on the screen here from the USMCA, but the exact same words, the exact same verbiage was also in the TPP. Sessions said, and I will read it from the USMCA, "No party shall adopt or maintain a measure that imposes a limitation on the total number of natural persons that may be employed in a particular financial service sector, or that a financial institution or cross-border financial service supplier may employ, and who are necessary for and directly related to the supply of a specific financial service in the form of numerical quotas or the requirement of an economic needs test. So what does all that jargon mean? Basically, it means that the governments involved, they can't place limitations or restrictions on the number of migrants or immigrants needed to come in to fulfill certain jobs that the company owners decide that they need immigrants or migrants to perform that job. And like I said earlier, Senator Jeff Sessions quoted those exact same words as they were found in the TPP. And here they are exactly again in Chapter 17 of the USMCA. So if the TPP was a threat on our sovereignty, and particularly in regards to immigration laws, then so too the USMCA is a direct threat on America's sovereignty to make its own immigration laws, as this would certainly circumvent that. The USMCA could even be described as a beachhead for illegal immigration invasion. For example, in Article 23, which is the labor chapter, we find here in regards to migrant workers that the parties recognize the vulnerability of migrant workers with respect to labor protections. Accordingly, in implementing Article 23.3, the labor rights provisions, right, each party shall ensure that migrant workers are protected under its labor laws, whether they are nationals or non-nationals of that party. So in other words here, the USMCA's Chapter 23 or labor chapter is requiring the governments involved to have laws in place that protect not just their own citizens and workers there, or to protect their own citizens and workers there, but to also have protections for illegal immigrants, for migrants coming across the border without any documentation of who they are, circumventing our national laws. They're to be protected by protecting them through legislation. Would that mitigate the problem, or would that only exacerbate it to make it much worse than what it currently is now? But the most egregious aspect of the USMCA is perhaps the Free Trade Commission, established in Chapter 30 of the USMCA. Now, this Free Trade Commission, established in Chapter 30, it calls for the establishment of 16 committees. Again, these committees are related to their subjects, and each one is found in their particular chapter. So all of these committees are established, and they fall under the authority of the Commission. Also, the Commission is given control over all trade, financial services, and more, areas of commerce that typically fall under the realm of our own Congress would now be unconstitutionally transferred to an international body of unelected, nameless bureaucrats. Here we have in Chapter 30 the establishment of the Free Trade Commission, and below in Article 30.2 we find the functions of the Commission, essentially what its powers are. For example, among its powers are the ability to consider proposals to amend or modify this agreement. In other words, the USMCA, the Commission, the Free Trade Commission that is, can make changes to the USMCA agreement itself without the consent of Congress. In other words, this makes the USMCA a living agreement. This same criticism was expressed by former Senator Jeff Sessions in regards to the TPP as to one of the reasons why we should have rejected the TPP, and rightly so we did, with President Trump, as a matter of fact, rejecting it as a threat on our sovereignty. So again, if the TPP is a threat, or was a threat to American sovereignty at the time, how is the USMCA not a threat when we find the same egregious aspects in this agreement as well? So just to recap some of the stuff we've discussed here in this presentation as to what is in the USMCA. One, we see economic integration. We also see the formation of an international bureaucracy in the form of the Free Trade Commission with its various subcommittees below it. Also, we see that it subordinates the U.S. to international organizations and conventions, such as the World Trade Organization, which is mentioned at the onset of the USMCA text, the United Nations, the International Labor Organization, which we covered, that appears in Chapter 23. Also, if you look at the Environment chapter, which establishes the Environmental Committee for the USMCA under the Free Trade Commission, that subordinates the U.S. to following the law of the Sea Treaty, which our U.S. Senate has never ratified. And a whole host of other environmental conventions of the United Nations are also mentioned in that chapter, which we would be agreeing to that we have not previously ever agreed to. All of that is in the USMCA. This is one globalist bag of goodies. We also find, like I mentioned earlier, in Chapter 23, there is a collective bargaining provisions in there. Also, again, in that same Chapter 23, we found there the workplace gender identity protections and also protections for illegal immigrants, which were in the Chapter 23 and in the Chapter 17 about market access. So, is this all sound like a big win? Is this really a better deal? I think we all know the answer to that one. In fact, if you ask me what the USMCA is, it's a step towards an integrated North American Union. That's where all this is leading to. There's no other logical conclusion to draw from this. So, who's the person behind the curtain, so to speak? Who is the person who's been orchestrating all of this to happen within the USMCA? Well, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, which is none other than Robert Lighthizer. Who is he? Well, he's the U.S.'s top negotiator for the NAFTA renegotiation / USMCA negotiation. Mr. Lighthizer is the United States Trade Representative, and he is a 20-year member of the Council on Foreign Relations, that same organization that we mentioned earlier, that its goal is the promotion of one world government. Is it any surprise that with a man such as Lighthizer, whose objectives can only be described as world government, should we be surprised with an individual like him at the helm that this is what we've gotten out of the USMCA? He was our top negotiator. And with Chrystia Freeland, the Liberal Party representative from Canada, this isn't getting any better. And don't expect reprieve from the Mexican government's position, because we've already covered President Peña Nieto's declaration of how the USMCA promotes the economic integration of North America. Speaking about the Council on Foreign Relations, another luminary of that globalist organization said this about the then NAFTA that was being proposed in Congress back in 1993. Dr. Henry Kissinger said the following in an op-ed that was published in both the Washington Post and also in the Los Angeles Times on July 20, 1993. Kissinger said, quote, "The revolution sweeping the Western Hemisphere can point the way to an international order based on cooperation. It is this revolution that is at stake in the ratification of NAFTA. What Congress will soon have before it is not a conventional trade agreement, but the hopeful architecture of a new international system." Did you catch that? So NAFTA was not just meant to be just some brand new free trade agreement to help us bolster our trade with Canada and Mexico. Oh, no. Much more than that, Dr. Kissinger explained. It was the hopeful architecture, as he put it, for a new international system. What international system, you might be asking? Well, he answers that further on down in his 1993 op-ed, where Dr. Kissinger writes, quote, "A regional Western Hemisphere organization dedicated to democracy and free trade would be a first step toward the new world order that is so frequently cited but so rarely implemented." So here it is, the opportunity for the globalists to get America, to get the United States, as well as Canada and Mexico, into the new world order. Step number one was NAFTA. Now, renegotiating NAFTA, we have the USMCA, which only builds on that for further integrating the economies of all three countries into one economic union, into one North American Union. So what do we have to do? The option is clear. If you love American sovereignty, if you are jealous of our nation's independence and liberty, then you know what you have to do. We have to stop the USMCA. But how can we do that? Well, there's various things that we can do. For example, at the state level, we encourage you to go to jbs.org, where you could find this model resolution on our USMCA and NAFTA webpage on the jbs.org website. And this model resolution that you see on your screen here is intended for state legislators to introduce in their state legislature to petition Congress to reject participation in the USMCA. Also, we would encourage you to not just contact your state legislators, but contact your federal legislators, contact Congress, contact your U.S. senators. The phone number for the Senate is there on the screen, so you can reach the call center there at the Senate to be directed to your specific U.S. senators. Call them, call your rep in the House of Representatives, call the White House to get your message heard by President Trump and Vice President Mike Pence. Let them know why you oppose the USMCA. Let them know that you might support President Trump, but we don't support this particular agreement, or wherever you stand on the political spectrum. Regardless where you do stand, the point is clear. The USMCA is not a win deal for America. So in regards to what we've covered in this presentation today, we would encourage you to go to shopjbs.org to get your copy of this reprint that you see in my hand here. You can choose to purchase the glossy hardback version of this right here, or you can get a free digital download version from the jbs.org website. This is a great resource because everything I covered here, in fact, more than what I even covered in this presentation, like the environment chapter, for example, and more to say about the TPP and how the USMCA would tie us into that as well as how the USMCA fits in with all the other economic unions around the world, like the European Union, the Eurasian Economic Union, and so forth. All that is covered in this reprint that has 3 articles that were published in the New American Magazine. This is a great resource that you could use to not just educate yourself further on the subject, but you could pass along to others to help educate them, especially people of influence, most especially state legislators, so you can get them to introduce that resolution to reject the USMCA from the state level, and also to your congressmen, so they would be informed about what's in the USMCA, because chances are they don't know what's in the USMCA. They're not going to read through the 2,100 plus pages of the agreement. This will help them see what's in there actually, and they can make a better informed decision about whether we should be in the USMCA or not. So we hope you get your hands on this and use it wisely. Also, for more information, we would hope that you'd visit jbs.org, where we'll have additional tools and resources and articles about the USMCA. Also on the newamerican.com, like I mentioned earlier, there are additional articles about the USMCA that cover specific aspects about that. So thank you again for your time. We hope that you will join us in the John Birch Society to help protect America's sovereignty and our liberties. Take care, and God bless you.